Yeah, great. So first, I want to thank Catherine for inviting me and my fellow panelists for spending their Monday morning talking about privacy. So by way of background, I'm a postdoctoral research fellow for the Center for Digital Society Data Studies, CDSDS for shorthand. And so my work turns primarily on legal questions surrounding privacy collection and information law. So in which ways is the legal system a passive observer or being mobilized in the protection or dismantling of privacy rights? So in addition to information law, a lot of my concern focuses on contract theory and property theory. So a set of concerns that I'm working on right now are kind of at the intersection of property and online contracting. So this plays out most vigorously in a debate about privacy as property. So many people imagine that one way to protect privacy might be to create property interest in that. But my understanding is that will only take us so far. So as many of you are aware of, whenever you use an online service or visit a distinct website, you assent to terms through clicking. So these are called click-wrap contracts. And so what click-wrap contracts facilitate is our rearrangement of rights and entitlements. So kind of getting back to privacy as property, with the way we have set up this online contracting regime, privacy as property only gets us so far. So if you have a property right in your personal data, you waive these rights very seamlessly and efficiently in ways set up by corporate actors. So kind of going off what Professor Gandy was saying, corporate actors have created this, this contracting architecture that nudges you towards giving away your property rights and your data. So at bottom, I think a lot of these issues may be thinking through the contract regimes and the contract architectures that corporate actors have put together in the online space. And so that's kind of, my pitch for thinking through contract and the intersection of contract, privacy, and property. And so my pitch for the grand challenges to privacy. So I think one thing that we as scholars and many of these people in the room and community members need to be thinking through is what exactly are the harms from privacy invasion? So as many people mentioned, Professor Mathiasen, Professor Gandy, a lot of kind of the conventional thinking or the folk wisdom is that privacy may be kind of a personal harm or a personal invasion, kind of this small data individualized approach to privacy. Like my fellow co-panelists, I think this is too restrictive of a view. I think we need to be taking kind of a more high-level approach, thinking through group privacy, sort of these classification regimes and how they target along large segments of demographics instead of individuals. So I see this playing out in kind of a number of ways. So first off, rethinking the privacy harms from privacy as what an entity knows about you and thinking through questions of power and autonomy and that sort of thing. So for a quick example, I think maybe some of you are familiar with the story, but there was a study probably now 4 or 5 years ago that Zeynep Tufekci, she is communications and journalism at UNC, basically wrote that based on the demographic information that Facebook has collected, Facebook can micro-target voters. So say Facebook has some vested interest in Democrats turning out for the election, Facebook could put I voted buttons in the newsfeed of Democrats. So you look through your newsfeed and you see that your friend has voted, and so these would be little nudges. So thinking through this behavioral econ language, Facebook could nudge or manipulate certain segments of the population to vote. in some sense, this gives Facebook and other corporate entities tremendous power. And these, on many kind of previous understandings of privacy, aren't really neatly encapsulated. So this seems to transcend the entity knowing personal information about you versions of privacy, and instead invoke a more kind of autonomy or power-based understanding of privacy. So really, I think the grand challenge is articulating these broader views of privacy and how they map to kind of issues of deep democratic and societal concerns. So, you know, if privacy can have these wide-ranging influences in core democratic institutions like elections, and also as we're seeing through kind of misinformation on fake news, these are sort of privacy issues that tap at the very core of democratic institutions and really aren't individual harms, but the harms accrue at the societal level. So, great, thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Lara Brandimarte, and I am very thankful to Kevin and to David for organizing this panel. It's been extremely entertaining, so it's really a pleasure. I bet I won't be just as entertaining, but I figured I should start with what I think one of the great challenges, the privacy challenges of today is, and then starting from that, I will briefly talk about my research a little bit. I've been doing privacy research for about 10 years now, and I think that still one of the grand challenges that we have, notwithstanding all the work that different fields have been doing in this past few years, is, I guess, related to what Mark was talking about before, which is, and the general topic of today, which is awareness of privacy, is this idea of making privacy salient to people. There is a commercial, I don't know if I'm supposed to mention the actual producer of the, I don't know what the what the rules are about.
There's some law.
Well, I'll just say generic. So there is a cool commercial that has gone viral this past few days that was created by a famous fast food chain about net neutrality. It's an awesome little video, just like any other model, I would say. Of course, it's not 100% accurate, but it does get the message through. People talk about net neutrality, and we don't really know how it affects us. And that little video makes it sort of relevant. If you give net neutrality away, you're going to have to wait 30 minutes for your, favorite content, or if you don't want to wait 30 minutes, then you got to pay $30 for something that costed $1 before, or it was free. So I wish that we as a community of researchers were just as good as these guys to make a video about why privacy is important to us. There's been a lot of talking in this past few years about something called the privacy paradox. You might have heard of it. It's this idea that people say that they care about privacy, but then they behave in a way that contradicts that statement. And I'm not so much a believer of the privacy paradox in the sense that I think that people are simply not aware of what the consequences are of their behaviors. We all like to have a bunch of games on our little smartphone that are free for us to download. I don't know, we all like our Fitbit or whatnot to, quantify our wellness, how good we are and how we can challenge ourselves to be, better at certain things and at setting goals. So we all like these little technologies, and they all have a lot of benefits. The problem is that while the benefits are clearly visible to us, then the costs are not as visible. And so whenever we have to decide whether to use that technology or not, we don't really have full information. If we are not aware of what the privacy risks are that are associated with our behaviors, then how are we supposed to make quote-unquote good decisions? How are we supposed to make things work for us? So this trade-off between costs and benefits of different technologies that affect our privacy are not necessarily clear to us. Whether this little app that I have on my phone tracks my location or not, what does that really mean? How does that affect me? What do I care if beIN Sports knows where I am right now? Hey, it gives me access to local channels. It's kind of cool. So how does that affect my privacy or my rights? And so I think that is still a big challenge. And I'm not even talking about, I think that this is about making privacy user-friendly. And I'm not referring to privacy-enhancing technologies. When we use technologies when we talk about technologies that help us protect our privacy, we obviously deal with very complicated stuff. In the past few years, computer scientists have been trying really, really hard to make encryption user-friendly, or, I don't know, two-factor authentication. And we use these big words and, all of this jargon, and the average citizen doesn't really know what we're talking about here. But I'm not even referring to that. I'm really just referring to make the concept of privacy user-friendly. Making everybody aware of what the costs are to certain behaviors. And so my research, I've done some research in this, but clearly haven't done enough because we still have the same problems that we had 10 years ago, and actually more, because technologies, of course, always go fast, and they pose us new and new challenges, and we don't know how to face them. So I've been trying to do some work on this, and I think we've heard some of the speakers before mention these nudges and behavioral aspects of privacy. That's sort of my main field of research. We refer to it as behavioral privacy. We study how people make decisions about whether or not to share personal information and what affects their decisions. And funny enough, we think that we are this perfectly rational people that know exactly what they're doing and know exactly what they're disclosing or protecting. But it's funny how factors that are completely external to our decision making end up affecting the choices that we make. I think Professor Gandhi before talked about default effects. That is one example of the things that I study in privacy decision making. How does the fact that the Twitter feed is set up this way affect the probability that I will actually tweet myself? Features of certain websites that are completely external to our choice maybe subconsciously affect our decisions, and we don't even realize that. So that's been what I've been working on. More recently, I have actually been working with David on trying to help people better understand where their information goes once you provide it to a certain company. We are trying to make the privacy policies, these big monsters of documents that nobody ever reads, easier to understand, simply visualizing where the information goes once you've provided it to a certain company. So we've been trying to do that. Also, I've been working specifically on surveillance, and I'm actually one of those who are guilty of using social media data to do inference. And I've been studying, of course, as you might have seen, I'm a heavy Twitter user. So I've been studying Twitter feeds to understand how people reacted to awareness of government surveillance. So as you might know, back in 2013, Ed Snowden publicized information about government surveillance programs, such as PRISM, for instance. You might have heard the name, but it's basically the idea that the government has access to a bunch of information that is provided by private companies and has access to a lot of information about citizens, and we may not be aware of that. So he was the first one to publicly talk about government surveillance, and I'm interested in understanding whether people react to that with behavior that some refer to as chilling. So you just self-censor because you're afraid that you're being watched and you're always under surveillance. So that's what I've been doing in the past few years. And I would stop here and hopefully get the audience engaged, or let's see, I don't know, maybe David has some questions from the forum. I'm not really sure, but thanks a lot for coming here today.
I guess I wanted to kind of ask about what the panelists think of the prospects for privacy technology. I mean, a lot of the time when you use that term, people imagine things like Tor or encryption technologies for email, things that are technical, difficult to use. But I wonder, in the discussion about nudging, for example, and sort of insights from behavioral economics with respect to privacy, whether there might be a more expansive understanding of technology, privacy technology, that includes a bigger role for example, providing people with defaults that result in less information disclosure, or that increases the awareness that people have of the group that they're being inferred to be a member of, what the consequences of that might be. So I guess, as a kind of open-ended question, is there a more expansive notion of technology, privacy technology, that you think is more relevant now, given your respective research?
David, I'd invite you and the rest of us to think about, since technology is changing so rapidly, that is the ability of deep learning AI systems and their move toward greater autonomy. The thing that I think we might hope for, in the best of days when we're doing wishful thinking about something, is that we could encounter a marketplace where there are trusted agents that are working only for us, that are not dependent upon selling access to us and selling information, right? That is the ability of human beings to predict in advance, estimate the consequences of changes in the technology for gathering and processing information. We're just not going to keep up. Right? So we're talking about systems whose purpose, which is perhaps checked by the state periodically, in order to find out that it's doing what it's promised it to do, right, in the sense of impact assessment for these new technologies. But we're going to need agents who are working for us because we don't have the knowledge. We're, sorry, spending so much time tweeting or watching movies that we just can't do all the work that is required to stay up to date. We need agents that we can trust, that are not being divided by three different interests. The reference is third-party users of the interest that when the information that we generate was generated by others, or inferences that are generated by others. Third parties have access to that, and you have no rights claims on what they do with that information because they bought it in the marketplace. They paid good money for that. It is our expectation about what the technology is going to be able to do in order to protect us. If it's trusted, and if the state ensures, power ensures that the technology works for us, not for anyone else.
So I understand correctly that it's an incentive for technologists to participate on the, to sort of take up the sticks for the common good as opposed to be paid well by a marketing company, are in favor of working on the side of.
Yeah, real money is out there. It's not,
Yeah.
it's not worth
That
it.
just shows yeah. Oh, please.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important thing to think about. But when I talk to my students about privacy issues or just technology issues generally, I try to give them a framework that there's 4 different kind of points of intervention. And one is individual choice. So there is that point of intervention. And so it often does require individuals making certain choices about what they want to do with their information and how they want to handle that. But that, of course, isn't enough by itself for the kind of reasons we've talked about. The second point of intervention is social norms. So partly kind of our problem is that our social norms are lagging behind technological advance. And so how can we develop can we develop new social norms around how data is used? I mean, if we think about the idea that how other people are sharing data affects us, then maybe we can think about, okay, as a society, your information behavior isn't just about you. Right? So I think that's a second point. The third point is technology. How can we, are there technological solutions to the technological problems? And the fourth point of intervention is at the level of policy and, either law, policy written large, or it might be a policy of the corporation, for instance. And then, of course, these things interact in various ways. The technology can enable better individual choice, and the law can require certain kinds of technological solutions. So for me, I always want to think about all those different kinds of things we can respond and not just immediately go just to the technology. I think that by itself is really going to solve the problem.
Right. So technologies of transparency that might increase awareness and lead to more responsible behavior of people whose privacy activities with relevance to privacy affects others. So there's a sort of, you can corrupt the distinction, but it's helpful to divide them that way. I see.
If I can I use your computer as a prop?
Please.
So this is the perfect technology. So there's a camera here and there's a sticker on it. Great technology, right? So in terms of nudging and in terms of what the role of us as technologists, or we pretend to be knowledgeable about technology, what can we do to make the public, better able to defend themselves? I mean, just use easy solutions when there is an easy solution, just go for the easy solution. Now we're seeing different prices of airline tickets because I'm using Brave as my browser versus I'm using Firefox as my browser. Or I'm using Kayak versus Expedia. We don't know because we don't have the counterfactual. We either use an iPhone or we use a desktop computer. That's the technology we have. So we don't see that price discrimination happening, and I think that's the main problem, right? People have information about us and they're exploiting it, but we're not really aware of it. So.
Is there a role for white hat AI? Along with the trusted agent piece here, what are the tools that people can bring to bear and what the future of those are?
You've been working with some, but so there are wonderful people who are doing those kinds of technology assessments. You also have some who are willing to go out on a legal plank and put themselves at risk. So Helen Nissenbaum, for example, in developing a way for us to say, I'm going to ask one question, then I'm going to ask 14 other questions which have nothing to do with anything I'm interested in. They're randomly generated, which is a way of making big data not so useful in that regard. And so there are a lot of folk who are, because of what their mothers did for them, right, that are doing the kind of research that tries to identify the risks and benefits there. But it takes so much money in order to do that. So we need both the culture to say that we want to pay for that. We understand the individual and the collective benefit, right, of having a trusted agent who is looking at the individual, the spatial, the relational, other kinds of identities, and saying, here are the consequences for these kinds of folk, but we have to pay for it. We have to create a special kind of opportunity space. Retirement is one of them, right? For people to do the kinds of things that they know benefit the collective, benefit the population, benefit the future population, as well as the current and aging population.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on this notion of opportunity space. So thinking through the issues with the smart city and why we can't seem to develop new norms. So as more of our life becomes colonized by these information technology processes, we lose the ability to experiment and play with systems for new norm generation. So I think a lot of Julie Cohen's work is really influential in this regard, that we need to spaces of experimentation and play, so we can, that's a first step to, bringing different forms of activity and social ordering in ways that we can start to push kind of new cultural boundaries that might, at minimum, create a roadblock to some of the more harmful surveillance smart city apparatuses that seem to be appearing.
I just wanted to jump off, maybe elaborate a little bit for people that aren't familiar with some of this work on what Oscar was referring to with the work, recent work by Brunton and Nissenbaum, their book Obfuscation. So basically what they're suggesting is that we mess with the data. we basically get the data to be crappy. And we do this by obfuscating our choices online. And one of the things they come up with is an app called Ad Nauseam. So what it will do is when you go onto a site that has these ads, so normally what it's going, they want to be able to see like, well, who's clicking the ad, right? And which ads are doing better than other ads. You can do a data analysis on this. So what the app does is it just clicks all the ads. So basically it just messes with the data. And that's really their suggestion for a kind of citizen kind of pushback, is that we just start doing stuff that obfuscates what our choices are, who we are, and that we develop more and more systems to be able to engage in obfuscation. And that doesn't just benefit the individual by making their data harder to track, right? It's as if Watson shows up to the hospital knowing it's going to be Sherlock Holmes. So he wears a disguise and brings like false props that would confuse him, right? So it's such that we're going to lose those if we engage in massive obfuscation. And where would we want to be? Where might we want to do that kind of intervention? Maybe in the commercial realm, and maybe where, look, there's benefits to some of this big data analytics. So I just wanted to elaborate a little bit more on that for people who aren't familiar with this work.
And also, just to pick up on that, there is amazing work that's being done at the University of Chicago. They actually have a whole fellowship that's called Data Science for Social Good, right? And they're fantastic. So they're using artificial intelligence and big data to study things that are good for society. So they would do things such as wealth-related projects, health, not wealth, health-related products. So they would, study how information about diseases spread over different networks in order to predict where states should invest more and in what specific types of diseases, or to prevent from diseases from spreading, right? So there are a lot of applications, good applications of artificial intelligence and big data in general that I actually agree a lot with what Dr. Matisse just said. If we start to obfuscate each other, there is it's a loss-loss. It's the opposite of a win-win, right? Nobody has to gain if each one of us provides fake data about ourselves. I'm thinking about personalized medicine. I don't know if you guys are aware of this new field, I guess, of research in medicine that's basically based on your DNA. So, there's always going to be general guidelines on how to treat certain diseases, but when you show up to a doctor, they're going to be able to tell you exactly how to best cure it given your genetic information, given your DNA. If we mess up with our genetic data, changing biotropins or whatever back and forth, then, of course we lose all of the benefits that come out of that type of research. So yes, I'm an economist by training, so I always look at trade-offs, costs versus benefits, and that's precisely why I'm always scared to say, one thing is definitely better than the other. It's always, I guess, about costs and benefits.
So could I ask the question then about, as you began with regard to collecting information, right? And we might say that that's lost unless we engage in obfuscation. It then becomes a question of who's collecting, and more importantly, it becomes the purpose for the collection. But the bottom line is the use, right? Its application. All of those are places for questioning and engaging, putting people to demonstrate, right? And here's my reference, and it wasn't to you, I guess, about First Amendment. It's to you as well, right? Notion about, do we have, or should we have the right to limit the speech rights of persons or the speech rights of entities? I'm looking at my friends who worked on saying corporations are not the people. They don't have Those rights, they were created in order to serve a public interest and a specific public interest in a specific community at a particular point in time. So we might address about what kinds of actors have rights, can be trusted to engage in analysis and recommendations, and what kinds need to be questioned, need to pass through a white hat screen before they're allowed to move forward. And we've got a lot of history which would provide us with some cues about which ones ought to be limited. And it's a sense of, do we want to say that we're wrong? We can, in fact, roll back. We can say, no, we went too far. It's time to step back and say, corporations are not the people. They don't have this right. They don't have that right. They don't have that right. Or they only have these rights, which were part of that which was agreed when they were created as an entity.
I have a question from a slightly different perspective. As an administrator for our local public library system, what I would like to know is, obviously we're very aware of the need for privacy and individuals who may come in to the library and not understand what it means to give away their privacy. How do we as the public library become good stewards and promote also the awareness piece of it, but also function in a way that promotes privacy but also safety at the same time? There are systems that we have in place that would, quote unquote, be an invasion of privacy, but it's how we use it. So what recommendations would you give for being good stewards of people's privacy?
Yeah, I think what you said about how it's used, I think that's really important. So I think the idea that, just because there is this information there doesn't mean that all uses of it are okay, right? James Moore has this idea of what currently with our technologies, information is graced. That is, it can just go anywhere, at any time. It can be used in just this multitude of ways. And so I think that is one thing that libraries have a tradition of, and in Arizona, of legislative support for, is that you can have this data, but you're not allowed to use it in certain kinds of ways. You cannot reveal it to certain kinds of people. So most certainly that idea of limiting where the information can go. The other issue is, how long are you going to keep it, right? So it may be that you need it for a certain period of time for safety reasons of various sorts, but after that, that's one thing that seems to be anathema, is the idea that we can destroy this information, right? We can get rid of stuff, and it's because, it's valuable. We want to use it all these different ways because it has value, but really think about, when is it appropriate to just erase that stuff? So I think that's, those things are really important. And again, transparency about what's collected and how it is used. So those are the things that pop into my mind. Question back there has been quite a while.
I'm a systems management. I have a master's in systems management, and I have a CISSP. And I've worked around the military environment for 20 plus years, maybe closer to 30. And I've seen power abused. I've seen people take data and decide who's guilty, who's not, on a personal basis. I've seen where maybe I think the data should, like the GDPR, should be deleted after a certain amount of time. If there's not a relevant investigation or something for terrorism or something, that data needs to be controlled and limited. We need more watchdog type entities that are not associated with a political party, but that are that are fair to the common public. And one more thing I want to mention. Equifax had that breach last year, and at first they said, oh, if you take our security monitoring for a year, you're going to give up your rights to sue them. Go ahead and look again, because they've taken that clause out. And by the end of this month, you can get credit monitoring for a year, and it's not through Equifax, it's through, I think, Experian. for free for a year if you don't already have it.
I think we need certain sites for thinking through kind of what we as a collective want to maximize and minimize in terms of data collection and processing, and so how we can get the collective benefits while minimizing the drawbacks. And I think that's where institutions like public libraries have a huge role to play. So public libraries are nonprofit spaces that engage the community. Sort of these community groups where we can start, gathering support and consensus for both privacy and all sorts of other social issues. And while I'm thinking through libraries, I just want to mention that specifically libraries and librarians have a really rich tradition of privacy advocacy. So my good friend BJ Ard has written an excellent paper on librarians as privacy advocates, which I encourage you guys